Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm really excited to introduce our panelists for a transdisciplinary conversation on gentrification. Unfortunately, Sharon Zukin wasn't able to join us, but we have 6 amazing scholars here whose work I very much admire, and I'm excited to engage in a conversation with them about a couple of themes related to gentrification. I have a couple of questions I'll ask them, and then I'll open it up to the audience so you can ask them questions, and hopefully we can all engage in a conversation on these themes. So to begin, I'm going to have them just go down the line and introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their research.
Hello, everybody. Derek Hyra. I'm at American University. And I just want to start by thanking Japonica and Loretta. I've been to a couple gentrification conferences before, but not one like this. The density of scholars that are studying neighborhood change that are here today is pretty incredible. And I'm so honored to be on this panel with so many scholars that I deeply respect. And I was talking to Lisa earlier today, and I said, oh, it's amazing, we're on this panel together. And she goes, oh, it just means you're old. So she's like, your work's not that good. You've just been around for a long time. But I study race, politics, and neighborhood change. And I think some of my work really is starting to go from understanding the gentrifiers, which we heard a lot about at the keynote today, to understanding the production processes, real estate finance, and how that is becoming key. I think we used to study where the gentry goes to study neighborhood change. And for me in my work now, it's like, where does the capital go? Because we can have capital investments in places that are gentrifying without the gentry even stepping in. And I think during the 2000s and the post-2010 period, with my work on gentrification, we're really seeing this process penetrate majority African-American communities that were bypassed during the 70s and 80s. And I think a lot of that has to do with the movement of capital. So I'll just open it up with that. And thank you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Derek. I'm Lisa Bates. I am at the Toulon School of Urban Studies and Planning at Portland State University in Portland, Oregon, sometimes referred to as America's most gentrified city. We can debate it. I think it is true that Derek is well seasoned. However, I think unfortunately undermining your reputation as a qualitative researcher with that indirect quote. Not quite what I said. My work as an urban planner is centered around neighborhood change, mostly through housing processes and non-regulated, non-subsidized housing. I run a large project in Oregon on eviction called Evicted in Oregon. And I focus quite a lot on Black communities, Black neighborhoods, and the experiences of Black people and Black life through not only, housing type of inquiries, but also through art and creative inquiry with community practitioners and community youth. That's me.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be at the panel and to be at this conference. My name's Suleiman Osman. I'm a historian and I teach in George Washington University. I'm in the American Studies department. So I'm in the humanities, although I've been greatly influenced by geographers and sociologists, and I fully embraced the spatial turn when I was in graduate school, and I'm very jealous of geographers and the sophisticated way they think about space, and I try and do that. What I try to contribute is taking the perspective of a historian, is thinking about and building on the work of everybody, trying to think about gentrification as a historical phenomenon that's changed over time, and building on the frameworks that Loretta Lees and others have done about different waves and how that could be fleshed out through archival work and thinking about this. In some ways freed by the not having the burden to come up with a generalizable theory. In some ways, I could just sort of say what happened in some ways. but it's to try to flesh those out, how it'll help us with some of the definitional difficulties if we sort of think about gentrification as a multifaceted thing that plays out and changes over time, and how can I build on that work? And the other one is drawing on work by Japonica and others, like she did an article looking at changing discourses about gentrification in newspapers over time, and thinking of gentrification also as a discursive category and as a set of anxieties that changes over time. And so what does that mean? How does gentrification just as a word, as a feeling, as, how does that also evolve from it being a relatively obscure term to something that is a repository of meaning and such strong emotion now? And that relationship between almost like a cultural history of gentrification, and then also gentrification as as old enough now, and even if you go back to before the word even exists, as something that's long enough to really look as a phenomenon that has waves or periods, and how do we build thinking about that temporally?
Hello, I'm Stefano Portelli. I also want to begin saying thank you very much to Japonica and Loretta for having me here. It's a privilege, and this bears all the contradiction of privileged people in this very complex moment. I'm looking at this fantastic background here, and so I'm very happy to be here. My story, I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I've been focusing for like 20 years. Maybe the word is obsessed more than focused about not gentrified, but people that get gentrified, and especially people that get displaced. So my focus has been on what happens inside communities that are relocated in a different space or even in a different spatial configuration. And this brought me to think a bit more deeply than I thought on the meaning of space and what space is for social life and social relationships, even for techniques of, for example, managing conflicts. So how much space is important for a series of like social dynamics. And I've been doing this, I've been drawn into this because I was in Barcelona in the somewhat, I would say, the aftermath of the Olympics of 1992. And that was terrifying because they were pulling out the neighborhoods down of your feet. They were tearing the whole city apart. And this brought me to be a housing activist and an anarchist. It was like the only ones who were really fighting against gentrification in this very early moment in which you don't use the word, but the thing was there. And well, we lost a battle to save a neighborhood. And when we lost the battle, we said we have to write about this battle. And I wrote my first ethnographic work. It's called The Horizontal City. And since then, I couldn't stop. And I ended up doing postdoc with Loretta. And now I'm working on Morocco, on Casablanca, when I'm interested in what happens when people are relocated, what happens to their ritual life and their religious life, which is also we think of religion as transcendent, but religion has much to do with space. So this is something that I'd like to share in this panel and in others. And well, actually, I'm in Rome. I'm based in Rome. And I'm like going back to activism because after pandemics, there is a wave of evictions there. And this draws a lot of our time. Thank you so much.
I'm Shani Evans, and thank you also for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. I am a sociologist at Rice University and an ethnographer, and I study culture and inequality, space and place, and racism, systemic racism. A lot of my published work has been about school choice and school selection processes, but I think I'm here now because I have a forthcoming book about neighborhood change in Portland, Oregon, in a historically Black neighborhood in Portland, Oregon. And I'm interested in that book, I'm looking at how Black people make sense of that change and respond to those changes. And what I'm trying to do is to think about racial change as a process that intersects with class change and can undergird class change, but is not interchangeable with class change, and to invite us to avoid conflating race and class and thinking about mechanisms and experiences of neighborhood change.
Hi, everyone. This morning I was in the lobby of the hotel and somebody came up to me and said, "Are you Prince Harry?" I'm sorry to disappoint you. So I'm really not. Actually, when I replied with my posh English voice, they were even less convinced that I wasn't Prince Harry. So it's not the first time I've heard that. Oh, God. Okay, so I'm honored to share with these amazing scholars. I'm very proud to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Also, so much goes into these conferences, the organization, and I think it's really important we acknowledge that. It really is an amazing effort to bring us all together. So thank you to Loretta and Japonica. Thank you so much. So I'm not Prince Harry, I'm Tom Slater. I work on questions of gentrification and displacement for about a quarter of a century now. Loretta mentioned the conference in Glasgow 21 years ago. That conference was actually where, together with Elvin Wiley, we had the idea to put together a book called Gentrification and a reader. I can see people in this room who are in the reader and now the planetary gentrification reader. So that conference was memorable for many reasons. That's one of them. Most of my work has been addressing the displacement question. And I also have an activist side as well with a group of students. In Scotland, where I used to work, we actually successfully campaigned for rent control. And a lot of my recent work has been trying to sort of to try and pull apart the mythology surrounding rent regulation of any kind, and to try and change some of the discourses that fly around about rent control being a terrible disaster. I also work on questions of stigmatization of working class lives and communities, and how those processes are related to gentrification and displacement. And I work broadly in the style of institutional political economy when I do this work. I've been at Columbia University in urban planning for just over a year. I think my appointment there is some kind of miracle, given Columbia's history of gentrifying Harlem and calling neighborhoods new names, Manhattanville, right? So somehow I ended up there, and it's maybe the starting point of trying to change the attitude of that institution towards its neighbors. So at least I'm going to try and see what I can do to maybe get a critical voice in there. So I'm very proud to be here. And
Thank you all so much. So the first question that I asked our panelists to think about is, how has gentrification as a process changed since Ruth Glass first coined the term in 1964? And as a second part of this question, I asked them to think about how gentrification has changed since they each first started studying it or first encountered gentrification. So I think we'll begin with Derek and move down.
Oh, such easy questions to answer. I don't know. I think when Ruth Glass first coined the term, displacement was part of the process. If you didn't have displacement, you didn't have gentrification. And as we've kind of gone in time, Suleiman can talk about this, it's like sometimes gentrification is displacement, sometimes it isn't displacement. I think when I first started to do my work, I really thought about neighborhood change, and there were processes of neighborhood change. There was economic development and revitalization that happened in low-income spaces. And sometimes we coin that gentrification, but I felt you could have equitable development, you could have redevelopment, and you could have resources going into underserved areas without displacement or minimizing displacement. And Mindy Foley-Love is here, and we spent 3 years with Dominic Moulton talking about gentrification. And Mindy said, Derek, you're absolutely crazy. Displacement is part of gentrification, you know? And I said, well, we got Lance's work, and Tom mentioned he can't believe he's at Columbia, and Tom replaced Lance Freeman. And I know many of you know Lance's work. And Lance saying, and Ingrid, I think, is here too, Ellen, and there's a lot of research saying that in gentrified spaces and non-gentrified spaces, the mobility rates are the same for low-income people. So there's a big question of whether displacement is a part of the process. And I would say with my evolution and being heavily influenced by Mindy and Dominic, I've come to the realization that you can't have gentrification without displacement. But there are different forms of displacement. There's residential displacement, there's cultural displacement, and there's political displacement. And a lot of the work I did in Washington, D.C. in the Shaw U Street neighborhood with Dominic and One DC, it was learning about, there was economic revitalization happening in that community, but there was actually the stabilization of a lot of low-income rental units. But people felt like they were being displaced, and they were being displaced. Their political representatives that represented them were gone, and it went from Black representation to white representation. And the cultural institutions that low-income people utilized got displaced. There's commercial displacement, and Willow Longamong is here somewhere, but her work on looking at commercial displacement, not just residential. So this is, I know I'm giving, Japonica said, keep it to 2 minutes. I said, oh, that's gonna be hard. But all is to say that I feel that displacement in its multiple forms are absolutely part of our definition and understanding of gentrification.
Thanks. I think maybe, you know, following on to what you're talking about around sort of gentrification, not displacement, I would say when I began to think about neighborhood change, for one, it was more in a context of decline and abandonment. Not really till I went to Portland did I begin to engage in a conversation about gentrification, because the context there on the West Coast is quite different. And I think that the starting point of the conversation at that time was it acknowledged gentrification as a change in community character and culture and like vibes, as much as a housing displacement phenomenon. You know, I'm a housing person, so I love to talk about housing issues and housing market changes, et cetera. But it feels to me like there's a kind of like a hyper focus on precisely measuring housing displacement as a primary entry point to having a conversation about gentrification and displacement now. So in the urban planning world, particularly with the sort of like YIMBY debates, YIMBY versus anti-displacement. And I think that that's happening alongside of this introduction of like the big property data, the like big tech, big data world, in which there's a tremendous asymmetry in access. If you're in real estate industry, you can get lots of information about properties and housing and markets and mortgages, and every individual person in here, I can promise you that someone can purchase a data set that will tell them everything about your financial life as it relates to where you live, for lots and lots of money. And so some people can get access to that, but then oftentimes our policymakers, our researchers, and certainly our communities who are experiencing impacts don't have any access to that information, and get stuck in a debate that is very much about like prove that this thing is happening to you, but you can't because you actually don't have enough information, and only we can prove what's happening. And you know, we're not actually interested in showing that you're being harmed. And I think that we've kind of, in that like attempt to be more precise, an attempt to, I think in the best of intentions, to like match policy tools to specific condition and care about context, that's all great. But where we get stuck in a fight and a debate about, is this happening or how much is it happening? Like, how hard are you being hurt right now? Is actually like a less productive way to have a conversation about gentrification, for where we began. I think that we have like probably learned enough about sort of repeated infinity loops of history of intended and unintended consequences by this time to know that in fact interventions in urban space cause harm to people who have the least advantages in our society, and that has happened over and over again. And I think that we, you know, we're sort of like living in a reality of, I mean, not too much with it, but like we're sort of destroying the planet and, you know, doing carceral death dealing and massive disposability politics. So I think we've gotten very caught up in a big data conversation, instead of a conversation about how we can actually make and imagine a more productive future, a more, not just more inclusive and equitable future, but actually to completely transform where we're going, because it's like, it's all of our lives actually at stake.
It's a big question. I'd say one over the past. Yeah, am I going to answer it?
Yeah.
No, right. Yeah. I have the conclusive answer here now. I think one of the past 5 years, I've been really struck about how, when you're teaching undergrads, of how gentrification has gone from being, well, 20 years ago, back when I was a grad student, gentrification sometimes, particularly among urban historians, was almost seen as a side issue or something that takes away from the much more important discussion about the urban crisis. And now it's become something which the energy in the room explodes. I mean, this is on the top of everybody's minds, which is interesting. And then this kind of shift to a type of almost, I'd say, from gentrification to hashtag gentrification. And maybe if I've accidentally borrowed that from somebody here, I apologize, but I think Loretta, did you use that term to hashtag gentrification? Probably. But that, you know, on the one level, the digital realm, you know, Uber and gentrification, tech and gentrification, but then also the word taking new meaning on social media, sometimes completely even detached from urban space, gentrification of cuisine or gentrification of the mind, or, you know, and is that, as us as social sciences, is that something we resist or we embrace, or we say, no, that's not the right usage of it? Or does it point to some cultural aspect of gentrification that we can trace backwards, that always was at the core of, you know, that anxiety about appropriation, those sorts of things? So that's interesting to me, is how it's gone to becoming almost the issue in the way that maybe, well, the urban crisis and maybe sprawl was in the early 2000s, but really, you know, and it's so that's interesting. It's a big shift. And I don't know if everyone else has experienced that as well, and how you're grappling with the expansion of the term.
Well, I'm not answering to the question either. No, also because I was thinking so I'm going to talk about gentrification in a panel where I'm surrounded by the people that wrote the books. No, what I thought is that the perspective I can give is from the place that more or less I know, that's this strange area of Southern Europe, which is not exactly Europe nor third world, I would say, as it was called. So it's interesting because before coming here, I talked to some friends and colleagues saying, what would you say if you were in my place in Boston University talking about gentrification? So we went back to recall what was the term when we first encountered it in Barcelona, Rome, Lisbon, Athens. And it's interesting because at the moment that I was struggling, fighting against displacement without calling that name, we call it real estate speculation or evictions. So when the term arrived, it was so powerful because it immediately gave you the class perspective. So it's the only term that has a class perspective. You can't do anything about that. There's a class perspective inscribed in it. So it's very hard to do what happened with other words like participation, that you just twist them to whatever you want. No, it's more difficult. But we thought this term is very powerful, but people will never embrace it. It's so difficult. It's an Anglicism, and they will not use it. And then a miracle happened, that everybody began talking about gentrification. Activists reclaimed the term. People in gentrifying neighborhoods began talking about gentrification, even without knowing how to pronounce it. In Italian, there's a lot of strange variations on the term, like gentrificazione, that has to do with center, not with gentry. So there's a lot of games on it. But this happened, sorry if I'm talking too much, but this happened exactly in the moment in which scholars, I'm talking about like the 2010, 2013, scholars began saying, no, gentrification is not the point. So it's like, now that the term is working, people began saying, no, it's financialization, it's assetization, it's touristification, it's a lot of other things. And this, I mean, I'm in this debate too, in Italy, in Barcelona, and everywhere. People are saying, no, you can't you're stretching the term too much. But now people are using it. So it's like, this looked like Bourdieu distinction, no? When everybody uses the bourgeois thing, then the bourgeois go on the next one. No? So that's pretty strange, no? Because I mean, so the point, my colleague, you're saying, okay, it's not enough, but it's okay. We're using this term because the term is important and there's a class point in it. And I have the impression, I'll say just this last thing and I pass the mic, that, and I was thinking this during the Sylvie Tissot keynote speech, that we know that the forces at stake are much bigger than gentry people going into neighborhood. We know that's capital, not people. We know all this. But the image of the person entering the neighborhood basically is a trope. It's a metaphor. So we use this rhetorical speech. If I was a semiologist, I would call it some way, I don't know, prosopopoeia or something, but we use this image because it conveys invisible forces. But the fact that we're still using, so we say this person symbolizes something bigger. The risk is that we pin people one against each other, because when you use a person to signify a concept, so this person risks to become a scapegoat. You know, that's what happened with tourism, touristification. So you blame tourists and then you go to conferences in Boston. No? So this, I think, sorry about that. No, but this makes us vulnerable. And so all this discourse, no, we are gentrifiers, so I'm sorry about that. I don't like that. I mean, I drive a car, and I'm a polluter. But I mean, the problem is the system that forces me to drive the car to go to school or to bring my kids to school or do whatever. It's not the fact that I'm polluting. So I think it's very important to shift the discourse on a higher level and have very clear that the idea of the gentrifier, well, it's just an idea. I know it was useful, but let's see if we can bring it to the next level.
So I think I'm going to do the same and not try to actually describe change in what gentrification looks like, because the people in the panel have done the work that I've found most useful in thinking about that. But more, I think, for me as a qualitative researcher, I'm interested in how people make sense of the word and of change. And one thing that has struck me, I moved to Houston recently, and I'm thinking about doing new work in Houston because I like to study where I am. And it seems like gentrification is used in a way that means any change that makes people feel bad or doesn't seem right. And I observe that both with my students and also when I observe different kinds of meetings around planning and when I'm trying to figure out what exactly I want to look at in Houston. So what that makes me, and what I see is that people use the term to promote their own agenda, whatever that agenda might be, as being, this is not gentrification. If we do this, then we can avoid gentrification, even though it's not clear exactly how that might be the case. We know that the word is bad, and so if I say what I'm doing is not that, then you can know that what I'm doing is right. And so I think that's something that I have noticed about how gentrification is used, is that it has this kind of value orientation that gives people cover to do propose all kinds of projects that may not actually be countering gentrification. Oh, you have it.
Okay, 21 years ago, that conference in Glasgow, I remember one of the striking themes that emerged from the presentations that I attended was an increasing interest in what people were referring to as policy-driven gentrification, state-led gentrification. There were many papers from all over the world about this. And I think that was the starting point where people were becoming more alert to how public policies and actually very grand state strategies are actually facilitating gentrification via forms of deregulation that make it possible for capital to flow into particular parts of the city and indeed beyond cities. And I think the biggest change I can think of since Ruth Glass wrote those words in 1964 is just the massive scale of this process, the violence of displacement, right? Especially in what people sometimes call the new frontiers of gentrification, right? The global South, where you see entire communities, often we're talking, hundreds of thousands of people evicted to make way for particular grand urban redevelopment strategies. And, there are people who say that we shouldn't use gentrification to describe what's going on. And these debates are endless, right? They're constant. And I disagree with that, because I think that when we use the term gentrification, it does raise questions like urbanization for whom, urbanization against whom, and who decides? And going even more democratic, who decides who decides? Right. And I think these kinds of questions are absolutely crucial in how we think about these processes unfolding. The other thing is a big change, I think, since Ruth Glass spoke those words. If you think of how the nature of economic activity has changed. So these days we're seeing what Marxist urban theorists call the secondary circuit of accumulation, urban land and real estate becoming more important to overall economic activity. And what does that mean? It means that basically we're not seeing any kind of productive activity. We're seeing extraction, the expropriation of socially created use values. We're seeing thieving and robbery of value. I mean, robbery has always been part of capitalism, but I think we're really seeing this now, especially if we look away from the global north. And I think these kinds of things, for me, are what distinguish the current moment from 1964. It's not to say these things were absent. I mean, if you go back to Haussmann's Paris, we were seeing some grand things there. And I think it's important to recognize that the term comes from 1964, but the process is a lot older than that. But I think the scale of the process is what I identify to be the biggest shift. And also how people like to call it something else. The people who basically are behind many of these strategies to improve the quality of life in cities, they refer to gentrification usually with an R word: revitalization, regeneration, renaissance, renewal, reurbanization. They all begin with R. And I see them time and time again. So that's some of the changes I think I've seen since Ruth Glass first used those words.
Thank you all so much. So I have one more question and then we'll open it up to all of you for a conversation, which is, I'm hoping you each can tell us something you've learned from a discipline other than your own about how to research, remedy, or conceptualize gentrification. And this time I'd like to start with Tom and then move in this direction.
Am I allowed 2 disciplines where I've learned from? Okay, so the first one I think comes from the history of science. About 15 years ago, I attended a talk in London by Paul Gilroy, a wonderful sociologist, who was talking about race and the question of agnotology, right? Agnotology being the intentional production of ignorance. And that doesn't come from Paul Gilroy, that comes from a science historian called Robert Proctor. Robert Proctor looked at the tobacco industry's attempts to cover up the health hazards of smoking. And agnotology was the term that he used to describe how institutions get us to look the other way when there's a problem. And for me, I found this incredibly helpful. And because I work in this sort of broad sphere of institutional political economy, how are various institutions that are behind gentrification, how are they going about justifying what they're doing? And so for me, thinking about how the production of ignorance unfolds has been incredibly useful. The other discipline I want to flag up and say thank you is sociology, especially Bourdieusian sociology. So I'm a geographer, and for me, geographers, have written a lot of the best stuff on gentrification. But one thing I don't think geographers were good at was thinking about questions of symbolic power and how a lot of the processes that we see in cities ending in the displacement of people from space, these rely on the activation of denigrating discourses that circulate about working class lives. Often these are racialized discourses. And I think it's absolutely crucial to think about the ways in which people go about justifying what they're doing by denigrating what was there before. And so for me, I think the symbolic power question has become incredibly helpful over the years. So those are my 2. I've got many more, but I don't hog up any more time.
I'm a sociologist, and I got a little distracted by the Bourdieu moment. I love thinking about Bourdieu. But I think the area for me is critical Black geographies. It's interesting. I'm not sure. I know people write about how things change in terms of the direction of scholarship, but I feel like when I started doing my research in Portland, I was trying to make sense of what I was hearing from people about their racialized experiences in space, and I really wasn't finding what was helpful in sociology, and I ended up really finding like Catherine McKittrick's work to be very helpful. And it seems like since 2020, there's been a lot of work that's bringing Catherine McKittrick and other Black geographers into the conversation about gentrification, but it's like 2020 since, which has been great to see. And yeah, I think in sociology, we don't talk about and pay enough attention to space and place. And so I gotten that from especially Black geographies, but geography in general.
Okay, well, the point is that cultural anthropology, okay, it's a discipline, but it's more a method than a field of, I mean, you can do anthropology of everything. You can do ethnography of everything. So this drew me since the very beginning to urban planning and geography. I have a PhD in urban planning and postdoc in the School of Geography in Leicester. So the working on gentrification from anthropology necessary. I mean, you have to go to other disciplines. So that's the basis. But then what happened after the pandemic, I felt that I needed to, I also have two disciplines, if I may, because the first one was finance. I mean, that struck me during 2020 was like, I can't keep talking about the imaginaries that shape neighborhoods. There's enormous things going on, and I'm not understanding a single word of what I'm reading. So for example, I've been working in this Barcelona neighborhood that were being torn down, people forced into buildings and into mortgages. And I thought the basis were the buildings. No, the basis were mortgages. So banks were pushing these people. It's 2007. Banks were pushing people into subprime mortgages, but I understood it in 2017, and I already wrote the book, you know. So it's really, for me, I mean, I studied anthropology because I was a hippie, you know. So I'm sorry about that, but it's true. I mean, so going into finance, trying to understand like the securitization of, I mean, what is happening in Rome, gentrification right now is moved by the securitization, I don't even know how to pronounce that, of public buildings that belong to pension funds that have been securitized, and this thing is changing the whole shape of the city. It changed it when they built that, and it's changing now that they're privatizing it. And this is so big that I can't be a cultural anthropologist, study gentrification without understanding this. So I'm trying to go into this, and it's a swampland for me. But the second thing I want to say is that something interesting happened in 2020. Take the occasion to say it because it may be useful for somebody. With the network of anti-eviction people anti-eviction activists that we created during the moratorium of eviction, we suddenly found out that the UN accepts individual communication of people that risk evictions. So vulnerable tenants that can prove that the eviction will cause a vulneration of their human rights can write to the UN and ask for a suspension of the eviction. This came as a lightning in the wave of eviction that we were having in Rome at that moment. And we actually began writing in a very legal language to the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. And we stopped like 30 evictions. And a lot of other people began doing it. When this is going to port, this began in 2015. Nobody knows it. And yeah, that obviously drew me and other people to study international rights. So, international law, how do you call that? And this is also another extremely difficult and faraway discipline for the things I've been studying. But it drew me to think that maybe, and I think Dominic Molden told me that sometimes, gentrification is a crime. So basically, we can address it through the language of crime, not meaning being criminalized, but criminalizing what is happening. It's a violation of basic human rights and treaties that have been signed by countries. So if you're evicting vulnerable tenants, you're basically breaking the law, the international law that your country had signed with the UN. This is big. At least it's big for Southern Europe, you know? And so this obviously drew me very far from my discipline, but I think that this is something that I should try to keep exploring in the future. Sorry, I talked too much.
It's a bit of a trick question for me because I would normally at an urban history conference say, oh, I've really been influenced by cultural geographers, sociologists, and most people are that. So that's not going to be particularly interesting if I talk about that. I'd say if I was thinking about some things recently, I've been looking at, because I've been looking at bohemian districts in the 20s, and looking at literature, literary cultures, people exchanging ideas about what Bohemia means, but also projects, and from Santa Fe to Greenwich Village in the 20s. And then is sort of interested in things like how literary figures, the memory of literary figures, but can be used over the generations. Like you could almost call it like the potrification of Baltimore, let's say, and how Poe is used in so many ways. And there's like the Poe public house. There's almost a palimpsest of Poe in one of those neighborhoods. The Poe public housing, and then a new Poe luxury development, and sort of the memory of Poe as being the Bohemian, American Bohemian, and how that is reflected in different layers of gentrified landscapes over time is interesting. And reworking, using literary figures to give new identities to neighborhoods and things that the other panelists are talking about. So that would be one answer.
Well, so my PhD is in urban planning with field study and housing economics. So like, sorry, it's me. I'm the problem. It's me. Sorry. What could you not learn outside of that space? But I would say that for me, it's Black studies, and specifically the Black radical intellectual tradition, that allows me to move away from what I think is actually in the mainstream, I would say, among very extremely well-meaning people who I believe genuinely want for a more equitable society, there is something that is sort of curdled at the core of our conversation, whether it's, say, like gentrification could be a good thing, or moving to opportunity, or deconcentrating poverty, that Black people have intellectual, cultural, and psychological defects. I think that this large body of research is actually tremendously gaslighting to Black people, specifically to poor Black people, and especially to poor Black women and mothers. And so it's become really critical to me in my work. And I mentioned, part of that is working in collaboration and working with art inquiry as a method in Black studies, to be very focused on life. So, Du Bois, who should have been understood as the originator of urban sociology in this country, but is not typically talked about. Black study is the beautiful ways we do, feel, theorize, write, and teach our lives. Black study as the beautiful ways that we have always recognized that in an academic setting where we are surrounded by ideas and practices that steal life, we will continue to live, and we will continue to choose to believe in life.
Wow. How am I going to follow up from that? You are the problem. You are the problem. Can't follow that up. But I will just say that I'm a sociologist. I'm an ethnographer. And I think that the field, or a person in a particular field, that had the biggest influence on me and my work is in the medical field. And she's a psychiatrist, and she's here. And it's Mindy Fullilove, and her concept of root shock and how displacement affects people's health. I mean, quite simply, Mindy puts it as, when people get displaced, they die. It is trauma. It is trauma that leads to death. But then she followed it up with another concept with a colleague of hers, with serial displacement. Understanding that root shock is not a one-time shock, it's a shock that goes over generations. And when the contemporary ethnographer like myself goes into a community and wants to understand what's happening to people, are they being displaced? Do they fear displacement? You have to put that in a historical context of serial displacement. That is 20th and 21st century urbanism in the United States. That's the United States history for 400 years, displacing and destroying people. It's the imperial city. I wrote a book called The Cappuccino City. My new book is going to be called The Imperial City, because that's what we are. We are an imperialist people. And Mindy really helped me understand this historical process through root shock. and through serial displacement. And also Suleiman and his colleagues, historians, that we can't just understand gentrification in the contemporary context without understanding the history of how we got to where we are. So Larry Vell, he's here at MIT, you know, his history of housing policy, Tom Segru and his work. So it's like people in the medical field and the historians have been the ones who have really influenced me. I also have to say that sociologists have also influenced me. Mary Patillo really wrote a lot about Black gentrification, that we often in the US talk about the white-Black divide, and that is really important. But she started to write about intra-racial class conflict, that a lot of the Black middle class didn't want to be around poor people. And I think the conversation this morning was a little bit about, you know, do we bring race into gentrification? Do we just keep it as a class concept? We have to do both. We have to do intersectionality research when we're doing gentrification research. You can't talk about gentrification in class without talking about race in the US context, and I would say in a lot of contexts around the world. And lastly, I will say that what I love about this conference is it's not just the academics. We have activists. And who really teaches me is people like Dominic, the activists in place. I'm an ethnographer. I learn by being with people in place. And I learn from everyday folks in their communities. That's where these concepts come from: cultural displacement, political displacement. I just put words, you know, Cappuccino City, but the dynamics and the impact of these dynamics come from people in place. So really, everyday people are who really inspire me and educate me in my work.
Thank you all so much. This has been wonderful already. We have about 15 minutes for questions. So I invite the audience to ask questions of our panelists and also for the panelists to engage with one another.
This thing on. Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'm Ariel Gerbem from the University of Maryland. Hi, Suleiman. Thank you so much. So I am an urban planner, but I study schools and youth. And I was wondering if perhaps Lisa and Shani and maybe Stefano can comment on issues of gentrification and displacement, this dynamic that actually Derek was just talking about multi-generational trauma and how it connects to your work with young people or schools in particular in the context of the places you've worked and studied, because I feel like youth are often displaced in ways, and because of political dynamics, various dynamics, they're sort of left out of the conversation, but the ways that they carry this trauma and enact the traumatic experience may have some differences from their adult counterparts.
Here's one.
You want to say something?
No, I saw you raise your hand. So I thought you...
No, it's more like who wants to talk. Okay, I'll talk with him holding the microphone. Thank you, Ariel. What a great question. So I have spent quite a bit of time working with young Black students in Portland. And so, you know, Shani will know as well. So Portland's Black community is about 6% of the city's population. Portland is the whitest big city in the United States. And it has been, you know, there's no majority Black neighborhoods in Portland. Portland's Black community is actually very dispersed at this point because of the intensity of gentrification. So I worked with the last majority Black class at Jefferson High School. That is historically the only majority Black high school in the state of Oregon. And the class of 2019 was last majority Black class, again, because of neighborhood change in the district. And something that, you know, gentrification has been happening in Portland since around 2000, plus, I mean, there's literally no Black family in Portland that does not have multiple generations of displacement from urban renewal or other previous policy practices. So what I found was a bunch of teenagers who are, some of them have actually never lived in the historically Black neighborhood of Portland. They actually commute back to the school from outer edges of the city. There's kind of a right to return policy in the school that allows them to do that. But yet their own identity as Black Portlanders is actually very rooted in a neighborhood that they cannot live in, have never lived in, and in many cases, their whole family no longer lives in. They are, I mean, what was very curious to me is they recite and tell stories, actually like ghost stories. They're talking about places that actually are not there anymore, that were not there in their own living memory. And so thinking about how identity formation, healthy identity formation role, when you live in a place that you feel completely disconnected from on the other side of town, you know you have a historical and intergenerational tie to some other physical place that you can't really access anymore, is very challenging. And so the school actually became that site for them. And they were very interested and invested in like investigating the site itself. And which was, I think, was very productive for them. One of the things that's kind of sad is right now that building is in such disrepair. Their school district is actually closing the building, and all the students are going to have to go to school a couple of miles away, which doesn't sound very far, but our transit is actually pretty poor in Portland. And so it's like an hour and a half time difference in terms of being able to get to the school. And so there's a lot of fighting right now about how can the students stay in that physical building, because that's kind of the marker that's left as an anchor for them in the community, which is sad and kind of weird and not great.
Okay, since you mentioned schools and children, maybe I have a story about schools and children, because that's like the story that drew me into this obsession with space and displacement. Because actually, I go back to Barcelona, so I'm not sure that this is helpful, but I try it, because you have to imagine this small neighborhoods built in the 20th, just in the vigil of the Civil War. So 1929, 31, there was the revolution and civil war in Spain. So the neighborhood, some of these neighborhoods are still there. And when I was in Barcelona, I was not planning to be a researcher nor anthropologist nor nothing, but I worked in schools. And so the social cooperative that I worked for sent me to that neighborhood. And I began working with kids raised in this very old working class council houses, all one stories around these little roads, all raised in a very contained, confined environment, I would say ghettoized, but very compact. And what shocked me, I had worked with other kids in other schools, other parts of town. What shocked me is that these people these children had ways of dealing with conflicts, even with ethnic conflicts among themselves. So as educators, as teachers, we didn't have to intervene in their quarrels differently than many other people. So I began saying, well, so how did they do it? It's very trivial. It's like ethnography is. I'll call my father's gonna kill your brother. No, my brother's bigger than your father. And no, I won't kill you because your sister is whatever. I call it conjuring community to avoid recurring to violence. So this whole thing worked among children, but it also worked among adults. So the adults had ways of dealing with important differences that there were between Catalan, Spanish, Roma people, non-Roma, migrants, whatever, through techniques that were based on space, that were based on the fact that they were always in the streets. They were forced to face one another constantly. This whole thing shattered when they were moved 200 meters nearby in another spatial conformation, which is the high-rise buildings. The whole thing didn't work. The same people. So they recur to, well, violence increased, ethnic conflict increased, police came much more often in the neighborhood. And this obviously led to create what mainly called gangs, I would say, like groups of people that are constantly one against the other. So I think that there is something very structural with rootedness, and that has to do a lot with the history of people in one place and with the way that people use space. And this thing is very fragile, it's very delicate, which also, as Mindy says.
Thank you. Are there other questions?
Hi, I'm Mindy. I have a question about this room. I find this a very lively group of people. I know a lot of people here, and they're loud, chatty people, and you guys are telling good jokes and great stories, and everybody's kind of not. Everybody's kind of like tamped down, even me. Right? I'm trying to get the crowd moving. I think we need a wave or something. I think it's structural. I think there's and I don't know how we do it, what you do in a long room. I'm looking at Tom, I'm looking at, Lisa, what you think? We got to do something about this room because people have a lot. They're feeling. I can feel feeling, but everybody's like, I can't say anything. We're feeling it, right? Everybody wants to like snap and clap and shout and say amen, and nothing's happening. So, Tom, Lisa, what you got?
Mindy, it's all right. So the wave, or we just bring in the alcohol early. Like, I don't know. That would be nice. Tom, can we?
This was advertised as a fireside chat, which for me in Scotland, that means Lagavulin Ardbeg, bring some whiskey. But anyway.
Notes for next time. We do probably have time for one more question. And then we will have coffee and maybe cookies.
Hi, I'm Jess. I'm a student here. So I had a question about places like New York, which are trying to combat gentrification by inputting things like housing lotteries and minimum and maximum income housing applications and stuff like that. How do you think, is that effective in any way to kind of combat gentrification? Or do you think there's a more effective way where places like New York with such a big housing crisis can do this? And then in terms of the race conversation and how that plays into gentrification as well, do you think we should take in consideration trying to kind of put people who are displaced or people who are at a disadvantage in more of a privileged position when it comes to things like the housing lottery, like trying to put them at the front of the line or trying to put them, in a better position to get better housing to avoid this displacement? Yeah.
Holding a microphone, so I'll answer. I haven't been in New York long enough really to engage to the level I want to, and that'll happen. But for me, I think to make a huge difference, I mean, in a city which has become almost exclusively like a place for the elite, it's difficult to imagine what to do. But in the outer boroughs, the furthest, the further away you go from Manhattan is where the exciting things are happening. There's a big community land trust movement, which. Sorry, somebody. Oh, chop chop. Oh, okay, fine. Okay. Oh, okay. So yeah, there's a community land trust movement, which I think has a lot more potential than housing lotteries. It was fascinating to see there's a big campaign to extend and at least enshrine into a stronger law the rent stabilization laws of New York State, because those have a huge impact on the people of New York City. And it was fascinating to see economists get very upset about that. And I had people contact me for my view. You can imagine how that went down. But I think for me, these lottery things, they're like, Band-Aids. I think it has to be far, far more structural if we're going to do anything. And it's about the social ownership of land, the decommodification of housing, to use the phrase of Peter Marcuse. So for me, this is where the debate should go. It's not about a sort of random allocation of a winning lottery ticket. It has to be something deeper than that, in my view.
A couple things. I mean, lotteries and those, the smoke and mirrors, that's not going to do it. It's not going to give people opportunities or enough people opportunities. And I think that a lot of the displacement that we saw in the 90s and the 2000s, it was state-led gentrification, as Tom mentioned, and it was in the US, the knocking down of public housing, right? And it was that in the UK, and Loretta's studied that. So we took out in the US the 1-for-1 replacement law. A lot of the public housing went down because housing authorities didn't need to replace the units. Why can't we just put back the 1-for-1 replacement? We've knocked down most of the distressed public housing in the US, so we should be investing in our public housing to prevent and minimize displacement. But that's not even on the political radar screen at all. But it's a simple thing that we could do. We should also have build first principles that if we're going to do mixed income housing, that we build the housing for low and moderate income people first before we do the market rate housing. Developers will make their money, but it'll take them a little bit more time to do. Again, prevents displacement. But I've learned with my research, and I talked about it, it's not just residential displacement, we've got political and cultural displacement. Even when you keep people in place, but their community develops all around them and a new group comes in that has different tastes and preferences, they feel alienated, they feel displaced. So we got to keep small mom and pop businesses that service low-income people in place, as well as we keep low-income people in place. So we have to do anti-small displacement strategies. And again, Willow, we've got a group from the Eden Center here in Northern Virginia that's fighting for the Vietnamese community in Falls Church, where I live. But their businesses are at threat. And we don't do enough in the US to prevent small businesses from being displaced. But we also have to think about political equity. So it's keeping people in place residentially, keeping their cultural institutions in place, and laying out a more equal political field. And that may be campaign finance reform, which I don't know how many specialists we have on that. Stefano talked about how he became a finance major because he had to learn about interest rates and mortgages. Well, some of us need to be a little bit more educated on campaign finance reform if we want to have political equity. And I think you need all three things to make sure that low-income people strive and thrive in places when investments come in.
So I think so I actually love housing. I'm like very into housing supply. There's almost no place in the Pacific Northwest that does not desperately need more housing, like a lot more housing. I'm for housing supply. The problem is that there's also no place in any combination of economic context or historical moment or market or development in which poor people, poor renters, and again, especially people of color, have not been displaced because we didn't really care. People were being displaced during the recession. People were being displaced when there's lots of construction. We have a policy in Portland in the current urban renewal area that's historically Black neighborhood that people who have been displaced from the neighborhood before get priority into subsidized regulated housing that is entirely operated by nonprofit community development corporations. This is a building in my neighborhood in which 2/3 of the households in 2023 have had an eviction filed against them by a nonprofit community development corporation in a subsidized housing. So if we don't care a lot about displacement and do something about it very specifically, and I think, again, it is about the politics, it's about community organizing, it's about power building, and it's about reshaping the priorities of from our public sector to our nonprofit sector and philanthropic sector, but really building people power, we're not going to be able to stop this from happening no matter what other policy context is happening. I just think we care here in this room, but in the mainstream, people just haven't cared enough to stop this from happening.
We have like maybe 30 seconds more if you want to say something quickly.
Okay.
Okay.
Want to go?
I don't know if I can say anything in 30 seconds. I just wanted to build on what Derek was saying about different kinds of displacement and to bring back the point that about thinking about race and racism and also thinking about class. And I think what I'm hearing over the day and what I think is really common in the gentrification research is that we think about class first and then we think about race through class. Like race matters both because race undergirds economic processes, capitalist processes, and also because of the relationship between race and class of people. But I think also we need to think about everyday racism and how everyday racism shapes people's lives and the way that the experience of, having the cops called on you all the time and the experience of people looking at you as if you don't belong in a place And so when, like Derek was talking about shops and how important shops are for low-income people, but I think also we need to think about how important places are in terms of feeling like you're not always out of place. That is not determined by class questions only. And so when we're thinking about race, that we need to think about it as its own thing, not only how it relates to class.
All right, I think we have to pause. I want to thank you all for a wonderful conversation.